Hey everyone, and welcome to something a little bit different on my channel. Somebody sent me a message on YouTube and said, hey, so I know that you build websites and stuff, and perhaps you could make a video showing, talking about JavaScript or something like that. And I actually thought that was quite a good idea, but I don't actually have any JavaScript projects that I want to show you guys yet, but I figured I could talk you through the little placeholder website I put up for my YouTube channel a few weeks ago. So if you go to shiblevelsup.com, it'll take you to this little placeholder site with my logo and a link at the bottom. And I thought we could go through that. I don't know, this might be a little bit boring. I hope not. But I thought I'd talk you through the HTML and the CSS for it, because it's very simple, and hopefully it'll give you a little bit of an introduction to how to build a website and make it look pretty and do some animations and stuff. So the first thing about a website is that it will have an HTML page to it. So, and it's always called index.html, in this case index.ejs, because I'm using, it's just a little Node.js website, which is a whole other thing for a whole other video that we can go into. But basically this is a template for the page. And so an HTML page will always start off with a doc type HTML. In previous versions of HTML, we're up to HTML5 at the moment. So in previous versions, this was really long and complicated, but in HTML5, it's a lot more simple. And this one here that says doc type HTML just says this is an HTML5 page. So the browser will know that it will need to render HTML5 elements. So then we go on to say HTML, which again says this is an HTML, this is what's included in the page. The head tag, so these are called tags, and you can put stuff in them. So the head tag you always include in a page, and the head tag includes data about the page. So this isn't stuff that gets rendered on the page, you never see any of this on the page, but it tells the browser, and also it tells Google when Google is doing its indexing of websites, what to look for. So the title tag contains whatever you want the tab. So up here, the tab here, mine says Shib Levels Up. The title tag will, whatever you put in that will be up here. You can also include in your head tag any JavaScript or CSS that you're using. So I've got jQuery in here that I'm using. I'm not actually using it on the site. I'm probably planning on doing something with it. But it's here. I'm just reading this in from Google. jQuery is JavaScript, but it's a type of JavaScript that lets you interact with elements of the page a lot easier. So it lets you grab them, it lets you do animations and stuff like that. Next, I'm including here C-Link, rel style sheet type, it's text and CSS, and this is the link to it. It's a style sheet for the page. So the style sheet, which we'll go into and I'll show you later, tells us what each element of the page should look like. And then you can also include meta tags. So this meta tag here tells the browser that you should, so we have initial scale, minimum scale, and it's a viewport one. So I'm going to tell the browser, if you're viewing this on a mobile screen, make sure to zoom in and be proper, because a lot of websites you'll go on and you know they won't have mobile sites because the text will be incredibly small. So if you just go to reddit.com on your mobile site, it's very small, it's like a desktop version. What this tag does is say, I want this to look proper on mobile, I don't want it to be zoomed out. And you can also include, I haven't, but I probably should have, a lot of other meta tags in here, which describe your website and add keywords for your website, which Google will pick up and use. When people Google you, it will show up higher in their search results. So next we have the body tag, and the body is where everything in your page is, where you put everything that you can see on the page inside here. So my site is very, very simple. I've got a section tag, which is, so it's a new HTML5 element, which just lets you kind of define or order out your page a lot more easily, like in sections. So I've just got one section here, which is basically the whole page. My site doesn't scroll, it's just one page. It's just this, simply just this. So I've just called it main. I've given it a class. Classes let us, what do I want to say? Classes let us use CSS to define what it looks like. So we can have many sections, but this one has a class of main. So when I choose to style main, it will only apply to this one. And inside that, I have another div. Div is just a standard default type of content that is the most common, basically the most common tag on a website. And I've given it a class of logo image. So this div is basically just this image here. And I define the style and animations within CSS. And then we have the footer. And inside the footer, I've just put a link that says Shib levels up on YouTube. And when you click it, it'll take you to my YouTube channel. So an A tag is always a link off to another page. You give it the href, which is where you want it to go to. And you can also actually set a target, which will tell the browser where to open the link. At the moment, so if we give it a target of blank, it means I want you to open this link in a new tab. But if you don't want it to open in a new tab and you just want it to open in the same window or same tab that the website is, then you can just leave it with nothing. And then so we close the body tag and close the HTML tag. And that's basically it. So this just defines the structure of my page, and it tells the browser what's on it and just basically what's on the page. These are the sections that are on the page. This is what I wanted to show. And then we can move on to SAS. I use, so there's CSS, which looks a bit scary, and there's SAS. SAS is a new type of way to write CSS. It gives you a lot more freedom and makes coding a lot easier. So what CSS is, it's short for cascading style sheet. Cascading in the sense that it's read from top to bottom. So you can define something at the top, and then if you define it again at the bottom, only the bottom value will be used because it cascades down. But I use SAS, which then compiles down into CSS. You can see here it's all minified and smushed, so the browser will load it a lot quicker. But I actually write it using SCSS or SAS, which gives me a lot of cool things. Like I can use variables to define certain things that will always be constant within my sheet, which is very good for colors. See here I've defined the color for font, for the main font, will be white. This is a hex code. Most colors you can define using RGB values or hex. So I use hex a lot unless I'm using alpha channels, in which case I'll use RGBA, but we'll stick with hex for now. So you can see I've defined color. I've made a variable called color font main, and I've said it's white. So 6Fs is the hex code for white. And so you can see here, I've used it here and here. Now if I wanted the color to not be white and I wanted it to be green, then I only need to change it here, and it will then reflect here and here. If I wasn't using variables and I was just using standard CSS, I'd have to go and find every instance of the color white and then change it myself. So that's why I use Sass. It makes things a lot easier. So we'll start at the top. To begin with, I'm importing a font. So you can see down here in the footer, it's a bit hard to read. I should probably fix that a bit, but I'll do it later. I'm using this font and it's called Chewy, and it's part of the Google Fonts family, which Google has a lot of fonts that it lets you use for free, and you can download them and embed them in your website. But for the purposes of this, I'm just linking directly to it from Google, which is fine. So I just say I want to import this font here, and I've then set it as a variable called font main, so we just say the font and the type of font it is. Google defines it as a cursive font, so we're just using it like that, and its name is Chewy. So I've defined it as a variable, so I only need to specify it once, and if I want to change it, I can very easily. So I've talked about our variables. Now I'll go through these animations. So these two tags are animations, and you can see here I've got my little logo just slowly bobbing up and down, which is what this does. So these two are the same thing, basically. Keyframes and Webkit keyframes. They're different browser types. So keyframes is pretty much used by all browsers now, but some browsers such as like older versions of Chrome and I think Safari and probably Opera are WebKit based browsers, which again is a whole other video, but they won't, so those browsers don't understand the keyframes tag, and you need to specify that it's a WebKit thing and you need to use WebKit. It's a whole other thing. I could do a whole other video on it, so we won't go into it too much. But basically, so these are basically the same thing. And what we're saying is, so I've called the animation Shib because Shib is bobbing. So we say from, and you specify the starting point basically of the animation, and I'm using transforms, but you can use almost any CSS tag value thing to animate, but we're going with transform because we want to move its place up and down on the page. So we're using transform, and we want to translate it in the Y position. So if you remember from like high school maths, X is horizontal and Y is vertical. So we're translating it on the vertical plane, and we want it to start at 0. So just its like default location, and we want it to go 2. So its end location is just 10 pixels on the page. And so that's a very, very simple animation. You can also do stuff like, so you can say from 0%, and you can then go like 10%, and all the way up to like 100%. And you can do like tiny increments, like you could go up from like 1 to 100%, and do much more complex animations like that, but we're just doing something super simple. So now we're down to our main styles. So I've defined a style here for every single element ever. which I do by just using an asterisk. And this sizing, this style here, box sizing, border box, makes everything so much easier. So if I don't define every element on the page to have this style, basically what happens is this. So if I want a width of, say I want the width of this image to be, we'll say 50 pixels, but I want it to have some padding. So padding is like, see over here how this icon is not directly against the side of this, it's not directly against the edge on both sides. So we'll say, what we'd say there is it has some padding on both sides. So if we then want to give it some, like say 10 pixels of padding, then the actual width that it would appear on the page would be 60 pixels. Actually, no, it would be 70. We'll just do padding left. If so we want the width to be 50, but we want it to have 10 pixels of padding on the left side, then the actual width that it would display at would be 60 pixels because it adds the padding, which is very confusing when you've defined the width as 50, but it's showing up as 60, so it's really confusing. And if you want it to have a specific width, then you need to negate the padding from it, and it's just it gets so confusing. If you give the element the box sizing border box, what it does, it includes the padding within the width. So I can say the width is 50, but it has 10 pixels of padding, then the width will still be 50. It will just have 10 pixels of padding on the inside of the box. Hopefully that made sense and wasn't too confusing, but it makes life so much easier. So now here we have body and HTML, and what we're doing here is applying styles to the body and the HTML. So basically the standard page styles of the whole page. So we always do margin 0 and padding 0 because some browsers will add in like artificial paddings and margins. So if you try to do anything, it won't appear flush in this corner. It'll start from like around here, which is not cool. Because my page is just a single page, I don't want it to scroll. I don't want anything like that. I just want it to be the exact width of your browser. So I say width is 100% and the height is also 100%. So what this says is, so the body and HTML is the very outer tags. So the very outer tags, meaning the whole page, is the exact width of the viewport. So whatever size, we can extend this, whatever size it is, it will always be 100% of that. So the next one, I say I want the overflow to be hidden. Overflow is anything that will display outside of the HTML. So anything, say that's like, if I have a lot of text, for instance, that would go below the 100% and wouldn't fit on the page, it won't be shown and it won't scroll to it. It'll just be completely hidden and no one will ever know it's there, which is what I want, because I don't want this page to scroll. I just want it to be as it is. And then I specify the background. So this is actually a shortened version of what I could write, which is very simple. But so I say I want the background to be this image, and so I specify the image on the page, which is this here. So I say I want this to be the background and I want it to be centered. So center means that from the top it's centered and the left side is centered as well. So X and Y basically. So no matter how big it is, it's always going to be in the center. Now I can specify like I want it to be 10% or 20% or like top or left, but we want it to be in the center. And I don't want it to repeat at all. So sometimes if the background is too small, it will just repeat. So if the background is too small for an element, it will repeat itself multiple times. Basically to flood fill the whole div or element that you're applying it to, and I don't want that. So we're saying no repeat. So another way you can write this all is, so this is a shortened version of like 3 different CSS tags. So we could say background image, and then we specify just the image, and then background position, and we want it to be center, and then background repeat, and we want it to be no repeat. So all of this gets smushed and concatenated down into this one. So it's super simple, but sometimes there are use cases when you want to specify each of these separately, but not today. And so background size we're setting as cover, because what this means is make it as big as you can, just cover the whole thing, even if you need to stretch it or enlarge it. I just want it to cover the whole area, no matter how big this is. It just needs to cover it. So if your image is small, it will stretch it out. But you can also do other stuff like contain, which will scale it, but it won't mess with the aspect ratio of it. So it'll make sure all your image is shown in the page, but it might not fit if the aspect ratio is a bit off. Or you can say stuff like, you can give it a percentage size or a pixel size as well, and it will smoosh down to that size, but we want it to cover. So now font family is where I specify the whole, basically the default font for the page. So I'm using font main. So the whole page, so whatever text is written on the page, it will always be this until I define it otherwise. And the color, which is so confusing, I think, because it actually refers to the font color, but every other way to change the font, you put font in front of the element, but not for color. So basically color is what I want the font color to be, and we want it to be the same as font color main, which is white. So that's so that's the basic default styles for the whole page, until we overwrite them, basically. So another great thing, hopefully this won't confuse you too much, about Sass is I can nest elements when I define them. So here I'm defining any section tag. So if we go back here and we have section, so anything within a section tag I'm defining within these 2 brackets here. But I can nest elements inside it. So what I'm saying here is any section, and it has to have a class of main. So dot, when we say dot something, that means class. When we say hashtag something, that means it has an ID. But I don't think we're using any IDs in here. We aren't, I'm just using 2 classes. But, and then here, so what this is saying is any section and it has a class of main, these are the styles that are involved in it. And see we have logo image inside of main, but it doesn't have an and tag. That means any element with a class of logo image that's inside a class main will have these styles. So this is a lot different from CSS, because in CSS, the way this would be written would be, so section would just be written as section, and any styles would be in here. Section with a class of main would be written as section main separately, and then any logo image within a section with the class of main would be written as section dot main and then space dot logo image. So it kind of, so CSS kind of, you kind of write it a lot longer, and you don't necessarily see that these are all kind of related, whereas here with this, it kind of it bunches everything together, so it's a lot easier to read and to code and make sense, and you don't end up with crazy long things like this. It's kind of all contained, so it makes things a lot simpler, I find, at least. So what we're doing here, section, we're not actually applying any styles to section. We could give it a width of 100% and a height of 100%, and this would apply to every single section ever, but we don't actually need to do that. And the same with main. With main here, we don't actually need to give it any styles, so we're not, but we want the logo image inside that to have styles. So logo image, again here, see it's inside section main, and this is the logo image. So here, we're not actually giving it any styles, we're not giving it an image, we're just saying we want it here. Here is where we do everything. So I'll go through them, and hopefully it won't be too complicated. It's basically the most complicated one on the site, which is not that complicated at all. So hopefully it'll be okay. So the first thing is Webkit transform, translate Z. So Z is the third dimension, and what this actually does, and see I have it as a transform here as well. It's a kind of, not a hack, kind of a hack. What it does, so it's not talking about X and Y, it's talking about Z, so forward and back. And this is actually a hack, to kind of force your whatever device you're viewing it on, especially mobile, to use the graphics card to render it. And I apply this because we're applying animations to it, and I want the animations to be smooth, and forcing the browser or your phone to use the graphics card will make sure that the animation on this is a lot smoother, rather than just relying on the CPU to render it. It kind of forces it all and says, this is actually quite heavy, and I want to use the graphics card for it. So width and height, 50% and 50%. This is 50% of the parent div. So the parent div of this is main, and so the parent main doesn't actually have a width or height, so it'll take the height from the section, but section doesn't have a width or height, so it will take it from the body. That's again how it's cascading. It all kind of relates to each other. So I'm saying I want the width and height to be 50% of the parent, which is this, which is the body, so in which case it's the browser. So the width and the height will be 50% or half of whatever your browser is, which is quite fun. Which again means it scales. I could give it a pixel width, and pixel width means it will always be that size. So I could give it like 50 pixels by 50 pixels, and it will be tiny on absolutely everything. But I want it to be responsive and work on mobile. So you can see here how it kind of scales. If we go down, you can see it scales nicely, which is what we want. So again, the background, we grab it from here. It's in our image folder, and it's here. And I want it to, again, to be center, and I don't want it to repeat. But this time I want it to contain. So I don't want it to stretch and do anything like that. I want it to be contained within the div. So if the width is the widest, we can actually look at it. So it'll always be 50%. Can we do this? Here we go. So if we have a look at it, and you can see it's highlighted here. It's the blue is what the actual size of the div is. So it's 50% by 50%. But you can see the image is the full height, but it's not actually the full width. And that's what contain means. It means I don't want it to stretch like the full width. I just, whatever the biggest value is, that's what it's going to be, and the rest will just be blank. So that's what that means. Then I'm using something super fancy here that doesn't actually work on all browsers, which I'm okay with. But for the browsers that do use it, that's what I want it to look like. So I'm using a mixed blend mode of difference. So blend mode is, will it give us a description? Here. Defines the formula that must be used to mix the colors with the backdrop. So it kind of gives it an effect. It blends it with the background basically. So if I inspect it again, and I can turn this off. Here, mixed blend mode difference. I can turn it off, and you'll see now it's a pure solid image and doesn't mix with the background. But in my logo, I want it to mix with the background. That's what I've used on my YouTube banner. And so it's a Photoshop effect, which you can't achieve. And because I wanted to animate it, I couldn't blend it with the background and save that out as an image, because then the animation wouldn't work. But I can apply this within CSS. So for the browsers that do show it, it will show up. And I've used that as well on the text down the bottom here. So the next thing is position absolute. So what this means is generally your divs will always be up the top of the page. They'll take up the exact height that you say. They will always be up the top left of the page. And be right up against each other and kind of flow down. So if I actually don't have any other divs that will push this down in the middle of the page, but I want it to be in the middle of the page, which means its position needs to be absolutely like in the middle of the page. I don't want it to follow the standard convention of the flow of the page. I just want it to be here, and that's where it's going to be. So position absolute, so it's basically where I tell you to be. And a trick for getting it to display right in the middle of the page is, so you give it a position of absolute, you say that, and when you specify absolute, then you can specify top, bottom, left, and right, and that's the amount of pixels or percentage it is from the top of the page and the bottom and the left and the right. So if I get rid of all of these and just say I want it to be 10 pixels from the right, it'll appear up the top here on the right. But a trick for getting it in the middle, you specify all of them to be 0, and then you say you want the margin to be auto, and it kind of, so what I believe happens is they're all trying to drag it to them. So just a top 0. My div would be at the very top of the page. And if I just say bottom 0, then my thing would be at the very bottom. So it's just all of them are trying to grab this and bring it to their side, and margin auto just says do what you want, and it kind of just pulls it all to the middle because they're all trying to pull it. So it just sits in the middle, which is great. And now we're applying the animation. So we again need to specify Webkit and animation because of different browsers. But here, so I say I want to use this animation, which is Shib, which we defined up here. So that's the animation I want to use, and I want it to go for 2 seconds. And this ease in and out is the how do I say it? Basically, easing is like it will go. It won't. The animation won't be jaggy. See how it's kind of quite smooth and kind of flows quite nicely. That's what easing is. So I want it to ease in and out. So once it hits the last frame, it'll slowly speed up and then slowly speed down as it gets to it. So it's not like super jaggy. So that's the easing. I don't remember what 0 seconds is. Probably something to do with easing. I can't remember. Infinite is how many times I want the animation to run. So I want it to run infinitely, just all the time. It needs to run. And alternate means I want it to so I don't want the animation to run always from to. I want it to go start it from and then go to and then go back to from. So it'll run in reverse, which you can see here. So it starts at the top and then goes to the bottom and then goes from the bottom to the top. If I didn't have alternate in there, it would always just jump back up to the top and wouldn't animate back up to the top. So basically this is just the animation running in reverse. So to from, that kind of thing. So pretty simple. Not too much happening there. And then the last thing is just the footer. So again, I give this a position of absolute because I want it to sit at the bottom. So remember, the footer is this part here. It just has the link. And I want it to sit at the bottom of the page because it's a footer. So I just give it a position of absolute because there's nothing to push it down to the bottom. So I need to tell it that I want you to be at the bottom. And you can see here, I've just said bottom. So it's just sitting at the bottom. And text align center. So at the moment, the footer, because I'm not saying the width, it'll just take up 100% of the width. And I want the text in that to be centered. So if I didn't, so what this does, it's just like in Word or in Google Docs when you hit you don't want to make the text left aligned or right aligned, you just want it centered. You tell it to be centered and it will center it in the page, and you can see it's centered nicely in the page. So that's all that is. Padding is 20 pixels. So we can inspect it here. And see here, you can see so there's two things, padding and margin. Padding appears on the inside of a div or element, and margin appears on the outside. So here we hover over it, and we can see padding is the green. You can see the green, and the blue is where all the content will sit. So nothing will sit within the padding. It's just to basically add some padding, because I don't want the text to sit on the very outside. If we get rid of this padding, see the text sits against the very bottom of the page, and I don't want that. So I want the whole thing to have padding. Now we can write padding in another way. You can define it just like padding left is 20 pixels, or we can define it so padding left 20 pixels and padding top 20 pixels, or and the same goes for right and bottom, or we can just say padding 20 pixels and that will apply padding to all four sides equally. But if we want it to be separately, we can define it 4 different with 4 different numbers here. So it'll always start from the top and then go clockwise. So the top will be 20 pixels, we want the right to be 10, and we want the bottom to be 0, and then we want the left to be 10 pixels as well. So we can do it like that. But we don't want that, we just want it all to be 20 pixels. Again, width 100%, because it's absolute. So if it wasn't absolute, it would flow 100%, but because it's absolute, it doesn't have any kind of, it doesn't know how big it should be, because there's no kind of, it's not following the flow of its parent element, so it doesn't know. So we need to specify that. I want it to be full width, 100% of the page. And then within the footer, we have the A tag, which we have here, which is the link, which is where I specify the font. So an A tag isn't an actual tag, like it doesn't have the same properties as a standard div. So a div will always display as a block element, which basically a rectangle on the page, and you can style it as such, but an A tag won't. It will not recognize some styles unless you specifically say, I want to style this, I want this to be a div as a block. But you can also say, inline block, which will, if you have a bunch of elements next to each other, then they'll display next to each other, basically inline, otherwise displays a block. I just want this to be a block. Text decoration, I've said none. So text decoration, when you have a link on a page, it will be underlined, and I don't want it to be underlined in this case, so I've just said none. But you can say underline. If you want, you don't need to because it's already an A tag, but you can use this on anything and the text will be underlined. But we don't want it to be, so we specifically say I don't want it to be. And then you need to specify the color for A tags as well. Usually any text would follow the color we have set in the body tag, but because it's an A tag and A tags, you'll notice on websites they're usually always blue, or if you visited them, they're purple. But we don't want that. We want it to be white. So we specify I want this tag, this link needs to be white. And the font size, 2em, you can specify this as pixels, or what I like for scaling is vertical width, or vertical v width or v height, which just it goes by the width or height of your page, so it scales a lot better. Em is best used on so basically we've got usually we go 5 pixels, but sometimes like with retina display and stuff, it doesn't display properly if you define it in pixels. So you define it in em and it kind of displays better on phones and stuff. And then we have another mixed blend mode, and this time it's soft light, which I should probably change because that's really, really hard to read. But as you can see, so if I take that off, then it's white. If I put it on, it's blending in with the background. And so that's basically it. This is actually a really, really simple page. I hope it didn't seem too complicated. It took me about half an hour to build. It's not really that complicated, this one. But yeah, I hope you like this. I hope it all makes sense. I can go into further depth. We can, if you liked this, we can build something together. We can build a little page and I can go into some JavaScript or something like that. So we can do like cool things on the page or something, or we can build a page from scratch. But yeah, I hope this all makes sense, and I hope that you liked it and it wasn't too boring. But yeah, this is basically what I do all day. I build websites and mobile apps using this and JavaScript, and it's fun, and I really like it, and I really find it interesting, but you guys might not, and that's okay. But yeah, thank you so much for watching.